we started with a technical difficulty. We're there, perfect. Thank you very much, Ramon, and thank you to everyone who's come along today. It's such a pleasure to have you all out on a very cold Wednesday afternoon in February. So we're very, very happy that you wanted to come along and talk about 30 years, or hear about 30 years of the Maastricht Treaty, and ask potentially some questions to some of the people who have studied it, who were a part of the process, and just pick at their brains potentially. I know I definitely have some questions for our esteemed panel. I'll get to introducing them in just a moment, but in terms of what you can expect from this evening, we're going to have a talk about how the treaty came to be, whether you can consider it a success, should we be celebrating it, and I guess just some milestones along the way, namely Brexit and what the state of play is now and what our panellists think is the future of the UK in a changing Europe. And then I'll open up the floor for questions, should any of you have questions. We hope you do. As Ramon said, I'm a former student at King's. My name's Anita. I studied European Studies with Spanish. I started in 2009 and graduated in 2013. It included a year abroad in Barcelona, where I studied at the University of Pompeu Fabra. I could never have envisioned a situation where the UK would be out of the European Union, but that's where we are, and I'm sure we'll get into the ramifications of that later today. So I'll introduce you to our panel. To the left, I have David Davies, MP, probably very familiar to most of you, a member of the Conservative Party. He was very instrumental back in 1992 when the Maastricht Treaty came to be, one of the key figures in the mix, if you could say. Beyond that, he was then the Shadow Home Secretary later on, and then also the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union from 2016 to 2018. Then next to David, we have Simona Talani. She's a professor here, so some of you may be familiar with her. I was lucky enough to be taught by her. One of the few females here, definitely impacted my career and my ambitions, I'd say. She is a professor of international political economy in the Department of European and International Studies. She was also appointed the Jean Monnet Chair of European Political Economy by the European Commission back in 2012. And then just one of her many accomplishments included founding the Centre for Italian Politics at the European and International Studies here at King's. I have to mention as well, I'm only giving you a few nuggets of their achievements. If you go online, I'm sure you'd see a very long list of what their CV includes. And then to my right, I'm joined by another professor here. I wasn't taught by him, but maybe tonight I'll feel like that. Anand Menon, he's a professor of European politics and foreign affairs, and he also directs the UK in a changing Europe, so very apt for where we are. Aside from that, he's very, very vocal and has shared many of his thoughts when it comes to broadcast media. So he was the co-author of Brexit and British Politics, and also the co-editor of the Handbook of the European Union. He's also a member of the Strategic Council of the European Policy Centre, a council member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And that brings us to our final guest here, Stephan Wall, someone else who saw, I guess, from the inside out what the Maastricht Treaty was all about, similarly to David. And with Stephan, he chaired the European Institute's advisory board between 2010 and 2014. He was a member of the British Diplomatic Service for 35 years. He'd been a private secretary to 5 British foreign secretaries, and was a policy advisor, a foreign policy advisor to the then Prime Minister when the Maastricht Treaty was brought about, Prime Minister John Major. So I hope that gives you all an idea of the depth that we'll have here, from policy making to financial changes, and just really an inside-out view of what the Maastricht Treaty was about. In terms of if you need any refreshments, they will be at the end over there, and the toilets, before we get into things, are just through the double doors, because that's very important. I know we could be here for a little while. So that's enough of me speaking. As I mentioned, we are very lucky to have 2 people here that saw the Maastricht Treaty firsthand. So David, it would be great to start with you. If you could just please paint a picture of what the UK sentiment was like when the Maastricht Treaty was even a thing. What was the feeling like?
Well, I think the first thing to point out is the two people here who were in it are the ones with grey hair.
Or no hair.
Huh? Or no hair. Or lost all his hair, grey beard. Because it was a super high stress exercise in politics in all sorts of ways. It's also a demonstration. You know, when you read history books, it all looks inevitable. It's quite a demonstration, the Maastricht Treaty, that actually nothing was inevitable, and almost everything, every aspect of it, worked on pivots, as it were. And I'll just take you through a couple of them in quick succession. Firstly, in the run into the '92 election, John Major came back from the negotiations with what looked like a full-scale success. He'd kept the treaty had gone through broadly as people wanted, but he kept us out of the euro, and he's kept it out as a social chapter, both of which were very important to the Conservative Party. A big difference of view with Labour over there at that point, and it went through the House in what was called a paving motion, massive majority. I forgot what it was now, but a sizable majority. And then after the election, it was represented another paving motion or another motion, and it went through well again. And it was about to be presented, I can't remember, Wednesday or Thursday, anyway, about to be presented on the day after the Danish referendum on the treaty was due to be held. And there was a meeting in the Cabinet Office of Douglas Hurd, John Major, a senior civil servant, and myself, just waiting for the referendum result to come through, and of course it was a surprise. It was a rejection of the treaty. And this is one of the pivot points when things might have been different, because at the time I recommended we just carry on the next day with the bill in the House and carry it through while we had a bit of impetus behind it. And in truth, we were going to do that until about 11:30 at night, and then suddenly John changed his mind and we pulled the bill. And what then happened was the antagonism to Maastricht in the Conservative Party grew and grew and grew. So, one point, what would have happened if we just carried on? You know, that was the sort of first stepping point. Then they had to go back and renegotiate with Denmark. On the last day of the parliamentary term, this was the point at which the IRA had mortared the number 10. So number 10 was sort of broken, as it were, as a place to be. So I asked for a meeting with Major, with the whole Whip's office, and it was held in the Cobra room, very sinister, to say to him, when you complete the negotiation, can you get some more benefits for Britain out of this, also as when you're doing the same for Denmark. Denmark had a series of, I think, 4 changes to the treaty to get it through. And he said, I can't do that, I've given my word. And I was a bit surprised, you know. He went around the whole office, and probably the first time in history, the entire Whip's office agreed with each other and said we should get something out of it so we can resell the treaty. And he said no. At the end of it, I said to him, you do realise if you carry on like this, it may destroy your premiership. And John Major said, no point being Prime Minister if you can't deliver your programme. That's right at the beginning. And of course, after that, we had a growing minority of the Conservative Party willing to vote against, about 25 members, another 25 willing to abstain, but most importantly of all, about another 100 who supported the government in the lobbies, but on the way through would pat the rebels on the shoulder and say, keep going, my boy, I'm with you in spirit. You know. So it was one of those rebellions impossible to defeat because most of the party agreed with them. And it was a long, drawn-out battle with the Labour Party, who broadly approved of Maastricht, but voted against the bill all the way through to try, which is a wonderful piece. I mean, at one level, the politician in me admires their ruthlessness, but they pushed it to the limit. It then got through, of course, and but the effect on the Tory party was completely destructive. Most of this audience is too young to remember, but in 1997, the outgoing Tory government handed over to the Labour Party the best economy in Europe, yeah? And didn't get one iota of credit for it because they were still fighting themselves over Maastricht 2 years later. So that's the sort of political ripple effect of Maastricht. In terms of the treaty itself, I mean, it created, as you will know, the groundwork for the euro and the social chapter, and of course we ended up joining the social chapter after Labour won the election, and for CFSP, which promptly failed, frankly, in the next few years. But that was the run-in. So at any point in this process, it could have changed one way or another. And I've left out all the marathon battles and so on. If you want to ask about those, I can tell you. But it could have changed, and a complete history of Britain. Even another way, it could have changed, because John Smith was the leader of the Labour Party at the early part of this exercise, and he wanted to join the euro. And had we lost the Maastricht vote, the government would have fallen, and we would have gone into both the social chapter and the euro at that point, would have also created another huge ripple effect in a different direction. So it was a point of time when I was at university, one of the subjects I studied was catastrophe theory, where it was very appropriate to Maastricht. And as a joke, when the idea of a butterfly's wing on one side of the world can cause a tornado on the other. This was one of those times in politics. Butterfly movements on one side rippled out to huge geopolitical changes the other.
Thank you, David. So you definitely painted a picture of how tumultuous that journey was from prior to the start of the Maastricht Treaty right through to when the government changed to a Labour Party. Simona, I'd like to bring you in, because the essence of the Maastricht Treaty was for an ever greater economic and monetary union. Could you just maybe break down how the EU hoped to achieve that with these 12 member states? Because David suggested in some areas it wasn't successful.
Which areas of the EMU you mean? Well, that would be something that you realize some years later, around 2010, 2011. The rest of the world changed. We're not in the same economic situation. There is globalization, and I would dare say that without the economic and monetary union, many countries, including my original one, would be in a disastrous position.
Your original one being Italy, yes.
So I'm not saying, even though Italy was one of the Eurozone crisis countries, its position would be much worse without the euro. We can elaborate on this, but I got strong arguments, I may say. So I wouldn't say that it's very interesting to see how you were mentioning that the EU had lost, if basically you didn't pass the Maastricht Treaty, then possibly the Conservative would have lost the elections, and that might be the reason why you passed it.
The government would have fallen straight away.
Exactly. This is why you passed it, because although you were not in favour, you knew exactly what
would
happened.
So
it is. I think that the Conservatives and the government got what they wanted, which was exactly to be out of the euro. The social chapter is less relevant, because I wouldn't say it really did work, or at least it remained a little bit on. Like in words than in practice. It was much more complicated. Another thing which was introduced, the economic and monetary union requires a long discussion over 30 years. So as I say, I think within globalization, Europe, especially, I'm not talking about the UK, but Europe, the EU could have not easily survived the competition from emerging countries if it didn't have a single currency, and it still is the case, I believe, for many countries, including Germany possibly. And the other element is EU citizenship. And EU citizenship, where you have, could be relevant if you didn't have the big distinction between people moving within the EU and actually intra-EU movement, not labor actually, people movement, and extra-regional migration, so people coming from outside of the EU, which is their country nationals. And that is the moment when with Maastricht, it started much before in 1968 with Regulation 1618, but then is the moment in which actually intra-EU mobility becomes a reality, and is something that has made the whole question of migration different. As I said, it started even with Schengen, but the moment of where you really have EU citizenship is 1992 with the Maastricht Treaty. So I would add to the many elements of the Maastricht Treaty also the introduction of intra-EU mobility and the clear distinction with third country nationals, with all it entails in terms of securitization of Europe and the fortress Europe. So these are the elements that we can put into the discussion if you want, and then I'm happy to answer more questions on this.
Anand, I wanted to tap into your policy-making knowledge. What did you feel were the biggest challenges for both the UK and the EU at the start of the Maastricht Treaty? Because it was a very ambitious plan. How do you make it that it's a success for both parties?
I mean, the simple answer is you couldn't. The challenge for the UK with the Maastricht Treaty, I think, was after the Single European Act, the UK became a status quo EU member state. We were happy with the Single European Act. We didn't really want anything else. And we'd have happily stopped there. And that was the dilemma for us, was, you know, the market was what we were after. We'd got the market. The market was largely sort of Margaret Thatcher creation. And I think, you know, after that, the idea that we were sort of bounced into another treaty to do more things automatically put us in an uncomfortable position. So as soon as you start treaty making post the Single European Act, Britain's in an uncomfortable position. And I think on the European side, the dilemma was you had a lot of very high rhetorical ambitions to have a political union, to have defence and internal security and immigration and all those things included in the treaties, but very little political will to give over power in those areas. And one of the striking things about Maastricht to me was it gave the EU competence without giving it power, which enabled member states to set about, you know, what has been 30 odd years of blaming the European Union for things it couldn't control, because even though the treaties mentioned them, there was no, you know, the EU can't control immigration policy. It's dependent on the member states. But the Maastricht Treaty talks about immigration policy, so it's very easy for national politicians to say, well, the EU's failing us on immigration policy. The EU's failing us on defence, say defence ministers whose countries are spending 0.6% of GDP on defence policy. So yeah, I think it became a lot easier to use the EU as a scapegoat post-Maastricht. The other thing that changed post-Maastricht is, I think, probably up until that treaty, European integration had pretty effectively sailed below the radar because it didn't touch on things that were massively politically salient at home. I think that changed the nature of the debate about Europe. Is, you know, pre-Maastricht, Europe didn't really feature in national debates at all. Post-Maastricht, all of a sudden it became really salient. And I think that politicisation was absolutely fundamental to what's happened subsequently. Final thing I'd say is, you know, because David was talking about the social chapter, and it's sort of, you can draw a dotted line at least, I think, from the social chapter via the creation of the Fresh Start group in the Conservative policy to the retained EU law bill now. Because that debate about excessive EU regulation, which is sometimes phantom regulation, I mean sometimes it's quite ephemeral, is something that is still haunting us in this country to this day.
Just I may interject, I mean, I think one piece of the antagonism to Maastricht from the hard Eurosceptics was semi-irrational, because they were upset about qualified majority voting, yet they actually voted for qualified majority voting in the Single
European Act.
And a goodly chunk of the regulation actually is in that area, not in other areas. But it then leads to a circumstance where the European Union sort of shoulders the blame for things, which it may or may not deserve.
I mean, the other irony worth pointing out is, you know, we had that whole boring debate back in 92, 93 about the F word. And it's just worth reflecting on the fact that we didn't like Maastricht because it was too federal, and Gordon Brown, it turns out, doesn't like the UK because it's not sufficiently federal. The only problem is that the two definitions of federal are absolutely mirror opposites of each other.
Yeah, exactly. Stephen, I'm turning to you now, because similarly to David, you had a very privileged view of how things were going down both at the UK level and the EU level. So first of all, I think it'd be great to let the audience know just what were your attitudes to Europe at that time, and in particular the idea of this Maastricht Treaty that was going to create an ever closer union.
But I think my own personal attitude is very relevant, really. I was doing a job as a civil servant, and obviously having to try and implement the policies of the government. I think the background is, I mean, for Britain, the European community of the European Union was always a distress purchase. Right? You get a puncture, you have to buy a new tyre, it's a distress purchase. We joined because we concluded that there was no alternative. We joined late. We were kept out for 10 years by de Gaulle. We spent 10 years then after we joined under Labour and Conservative renegotiating the terms of our membership. And having done that, as Anand said, we wanted the status quo. I mean, the Single European Act was, the government under Margaret Thatcher did actually swallow quite hard. She swallowed very hard. I mean, more than I even realised at the time. And when I was writing, after I'd retired, one of the official histories of Britain and the European Union, I saw some of the documents that Charles Pole, her private secretary, had written to her on various proposals that were being made for majority voting at the time of the Single European Act. And she fought pretty vigorously on very many of them before eventually concluding that to have more majority voting. She also conceded in the Single European Act a reference to monetary union, albeit hedged about, and she did it, and people say, well, she was in a meeting on her own with Helmut Kohl when he persuaded her to accept the language on the basis that it was talking about cooperation. It would require unanimity to have a single currency, and anyway, Germany, Helmut Kohl, was opposed to there being a single currency. But the path was set, and the path had been set for monetary union almost from the beginning. I mean, the first papers on economic and monetary union were written in the early years of the European Union, before Britain ever joined. And Margaret Thatcher agreed, not long after the Single European Act, to a committee which was chaired by Jacques Delors, the Commission President, to look at the various stages of economic and monetary union. And she sent the Governor of the Bank of England as her representative, who, if anything, was better disposed to the Delors approach, which she herself opposed. She took very little interest in it, surprisingly. I don't think she didn't take it seriously. I think she thought, and she said at one press conference, that economic and monetary union would be just a name that was given to something that was actually less than it looked. And in fact, what the Governor of the Bank of England signed up to in agreeing to the Delors report was the all-singing, all-dancing plan that then was put on the table, and which she opposed. I mean, she said that Britain would never accept it. And the situation that John Major inherited when he took over was that the advice that had been given to her and was given to him was that Britain could veto the treaty, but we couldn't stop the other member states of the European community making a treaty on their own. And what's often forgotten now is that almost as important as securing the opt-out was to secure the absolute right, if we so wanted, to opt in. Because the British establishment, politicians and civil servants, were scarred by our experience of not having joined the European community at the beginning and then having to join on bad terms when we did eventually join. So they were determined to get a situation where we could opt out but also opt in without any penalty. And if you look at the things that John Major said in Parliament at the time, and he subsequently hardened his view on the single currency, but at the time he does talk about the possibility of Britain joining the single currency. Even Margaret Thatcher, in her last speech on the issue, the debate which led to Geoffrey Howe's resignation, because he thought she was being so anti-European, she said, this is a subject for a future Parliament to decide. She didn't absolutely rule it out for the future. So that was the background against which we were operating. An atmosphere which, within the Conservative Party, was already pretty fractious. I mean, John Major made a speech very early on in his premiership in Germany when he said he wanted to put Britain at the heart of Europe, and it went down like a lead balloon within his own party. Anybody who's Anunnaki enough to want to delve into this stuff, I recommend the speech that John Major made to the House of Commons on the 20th of November 1991. It's the first time any Prime Minister had actually held a debate in Parliament before a meeting of the European Council. And John Major set out very clearly what he would accept and what he would not accept, which was not just about the single currency and the need for the opt-out. It was no social chapter in the treaty, and all our partners wanted a social chapter in the treaty. The Dutch who took over the presidency of the EU from the Luxembourgers on the 1st of September, scrapped all the work that had been done on what became the Maastricht Treaty, and put forward a text which was about as federalist as you could, as a British person, hope not to see. So much so that even Britain's partners couldn't accept it. But that was the fear in Britain's mind. So in addition to what he wanted on the monetary side, John Major wanted to avoid a situation where cooperation on justice and home affairs issues became subject to community law as opposed to being handled intergovernmentally. Similarly for foreign and defence policy. And he wanted no part of the social chapter. And all those things were objectives that he had to achieve at Maastricht. And David had set out what happened subsequently. And two of the biggest things that happened, of course, were one, that after the government won the election, to everybody's surprise, in 1992, there were more rebels in the Conservative Party than the government's overall majority. So the ability of the government to get its business through was weaker. And the other thing was that Margaret Thatcher set herself up on the backbenches of the House of Lords and very publicly opposed the Maastricht Treaty. And so loyalty to the former leader became synonymous with being opposed to the Maastricht Treaty. And I think I would say that, I mean, David will correct me, but it seems to me that the ERG today is the latter-day manifestation of what started at that time with those who sat at Margaret Thatcher's feet, which included a young MP called David Cameron.
Thank you there. Simona, I wanted to bring you back in because we've heard about the single currency, and you touched on some of the challenges when it comes to the financial side of this ever closer union. But for you, what do you feel have been the biggest achievements from the economic side of the Maastricht Treaty, if they can be inextricably linked or separated rather from the social side of how Europe has become even closer?
No, they can be easily, because the social side is by far less developed than the economic side in Europe still now. And I would actually say that though, I mean, this can create debate, the Economic and Monetary Union was a success. And I say it in particular with respect to the fact, as I said, in the 80s, I have a beautiful chart that I show to my students every time they talk about political economy or international political economy, that in the 80s starts something which is the process of globalization. So basically what you have up to the 80s, the stock of foreign direct investment in the world, the global foreign direct investment stock is zero, around zero. And from 1980 onwards, it's beautiful to see, like with the UN figures, it goes up to now. And then when they say that it stops with the global financial crisis, it's particularly not true, because after 2008, it doubles up until now. So really, the stock of FDIs doubles from 2008 until 2018, 19. Then there is obviously COVID, but doesn't really eliminate it, and does not even touch it. It remains the same. So what I want to say is that things change substantially from the 80s onwards, and you have to insert this process of economic and monetary union in Europe, in the EU, within this context. And I actually believe that competitiveness in the euro area would be impossible without the euro, especially for some countries, but even for Germany. Germany is the one that we can debate on. Yes.
But doesn't that depend on where you're looking at this from?
Right.
I mean, from the point of view of Greece, it was a disaster. 25% reduction in the economy. From the point of view of, I think many of the other fringe, edge countries, fringe is the wrong word, edge countries, it was successful, I think. From the point of view of Germany, it's a runaway success because it keeps them on a competitive currency basis, which they probably wouldn't be if they're on the Deutsche Bank.
Yes, exactly.
So I think it just depends where you're looking, whether this is an enormous success or not. And there's one other thing. I mean, we never talk about what's happening in the rest of the world in these things. I mean, it often, and this is quite important in the context of the timing of Maastricht. From when we came in, 72, was it, to about mid-90s, broadly speaking, it was an economic success for us in the sense that it's very hard to measure market share when the size of the market is changing, but effectively our market share sort of doubles from about 4 to about 8%. And then about 95 or thereabouts, we have the World Trade Organization, we have that tremendous gap round, we have fabulous reduction of tariffs across the world, including the common external tariff barrier, and our market share, Britain's market share, starts to decline. That's about 95 is about the pivot point, which is, in the context of this, is quite important. And I think it's quite important just to keep that in the back of your mind, that this ship of the Maastricht Treaty is sailing in a very changing weather system from one to the other.
Yeah.
So, Simona, to continue your
Sorry,
point then,
sorry.
do
No,
you
it's
think
okay.
that the success of the Maastricht Treaty, as David is suggesting there, from an economic perspective, is really dependent on which member state you are when you're looking at it? Or
Not really, because it didn't include the counterfactual, so you don't know where Greece would be if it didn't join the euro area. And honestly, I'm not sure. I mean, there are a number of factors that influence success or not in economic terms. Certainly, we agree completely on Germany. On this, there is no doubt, because one of the reasons why you got the euro is because it's less appreciated than the Deutschmark by definition, so gives competitive edge to Germany. That's clear. It's something that cannot be debated. But on the other hand, you also have other countries that would have not, for example, I can give you the example of Italy. The case of Italy is interesting because without the euro, we would be competing on wages or salaries with South Korea, North Korea, not South Korea. Basically, we have no other. We manage not to have any other competitive advantage apart from the fact that we have basically the euro, no others. And so the euro integrates economically the euro area enormously. And that's something that is a big advantage for Italy. Otherwise, if we were out of it, apart from the enormous amount of debt, which would be actually in lire, I don't even want to imagine how big it would be, or is already big enough. I'm talking about fiscal debt. But also, we have no other, I mean, we did manage to have no increase in productivity, which is something we share with the UK in the last 20 years. We managed not to have any technological developments or involvement in technological manufacturing industry. Is a manufacturing country, which is export-oriented manufacturing country with low skills level, and that means that if we were not in the euro, we'd be possibly competing with China on salaries, which is impossible, as you can imagine. So I'm not sure we'd be much better off outside it. And most of our hold together the little bit that's remained. And actually, you also have to consider that nowadays you cannot talk about national champions in the manufacturing sector. They're all transnational companies, and transnational companies have a different way of, dealing with them. Global competition, including the fact that they have to rely on some form of stable currency, which I would say the euro is, but is something that we can discuss. That does not include the UK. The UK is a completely different story. I'm not saying that they should have joined like Italy did in any way.
But also we're a service economy, really, rather than
Exactly.
manufacturing one. So the productivity numbers don't really mean much in truth.
Yes, no, I agree completely.
No.
And that's why we have you, Simona, to give us, you and Anand, to try and give us a balanced view of things, both from the UK and EU perspective. Anand, when you consider the monetary union and the Eurozone, as Simona put it there, and how it has been a success, what would you think have been the failures of it originating from the Maastricht Treaty then?
Well, I mean, Greece during the euro crisis was a failure, quite clearly. I think there's a fundamental issue about the sort of halfway house that the European Union currently represents, which is it's an odd construct, isn't it, to have a central bank that is so independent by international comparator standards with absolutely no government next to or above it. And for whatever the economic case might be, the structure of the European Union and of the Eurozone just concerns me because it fails basic democratic tests. And it seems to me that the logic of the European Union is you either create governmental structures at the European Union or that problem remains. At the moment, it just seems to be an accident waiting to happen, in my book, is in the sense that, if the Eurozone crisis had spread in anywhere near the same extent to Italy as it had affected Greece, that would have been such an enormous economic and political crisis that the whole thing would have fallen apart. And there's a basic democratic instability to the system that concerns me, and that proponents of European integration will say it's happening in small
Isn't that
steps.
written in from the beginning? Doesn't
Yeah.
it go right back to Monet and Schumann? I mean, they never really intended it to be a truly democratic institution.
Well, it goes back to Maastricht, certainly. I think Monet and Schumann, it was a slightly different idea. It was functional. And yes, I think for some of the creators of European, let's be honest about this, some of the benefits provided economically by European integration are benefits that are possible because it bypasses national democratic systems. That's absolutely the case. It's a very functional story of growth without necessarily going through all the headaches of, if you go back to immediately after the Cold War, it was very interesting that Helmut Kohl wanted to deal with asylum at European Union level, and German officials were relatively honest about it at the time because it would have been too hard domestically to do it via German politics. So yeah, sometimes it allows you to bypass domestic politics. But the structure of the Eurozone is inherently unstable from a political point of view, I'd say, whatever the economic benefits it brings to some countries. And that, I'm still not sure how the European Union goes about addressing that.
Well, in political terms, I mean, just to put my cards on the table, the thing that really made me fed up with the Union was the treatment of Greece. The treatment of Greece, I mean, we would never treat a part of our country that way. And it was a disgrace. And that comes straight out of the anti-democratic or the non-democratic element of it. Can I just pick up one point before we forget it altogether? And it's something I was wrong about there. This is the question of the social chapter. Let me tell you a sort of little cameo. In the run-up to I think it was Amsterdam, actually, I was at a dinner in Bordeaux. It was basically the French government and the British government sitting together. And we were talking about the social chapter, and we opted out. And they kept saying, you're going to have to opt in, and all these French politicians. And I said, come on. I said, whatever it was, the sort of the 48-hour week or whatever it was, is not going to fix your competitive problems from our point of view. And they said, once you're in, it'll be different. And they obviously intended, which is what I suspected, they intended it should be a much bigger entity than it turned out to be, and it failed. From their point of view, it failed. My point of view, it became less harmful. Just an aside. So.
But what's interesting about that debate, I think, is the light it casts on the current debate about level playing field and standards and things like that. Because you remember, it was a Hoover factory, wasn't it, that shut in France that sparked the debate about social dumping in Europe. I think it was the late 1980s that Hoover closed down a factory, and they said, we've closed down this factory in France because of bloody social costs in France, and you pay so much in social costs, it's not economically viable. And at that point, the debate was sparked. And that debate remains quite fresh, I think, in the EU psyche, and it's why they insist on the level playing field provisions, and why that sort of spectre of social dumping haunts the debate to this day, and haunts the debate over the retained EU law bill and onwards.
If I may say something about the political element in it, the political and treatment of Greece. The treatment of Greece and political element is strictly related to adopting a common fiscal policy, which means that Greece would not be treated as it was because it was imposed austerity, whereas it would have be given money without, just like having Eurobonds financing the re-establishment of Greece. So that is something, and this is, as you all know, it's very difficult to have a common fiscal policy, which means common taxes, which means at that stage it means a political union in a way, because there is no taxation without representation, and if we go there, I don't want to give a lecture, it's a bit too much, but actually that's the idea. But the social chapter, honestly, is another issue which is related to globalization, because you cannot have a social chapter in Europe when you have global value chains and you produce in China. I'm not that you shouldn't have it, I'm not saying this, I'm just saying that it's really a global problem at that stage. It becomes a global, the social standards and the social standards of production should be something that then becomes a global issue.
David, Anand touched on the democratic deficit that seems to be inherent within the EU, that these institutions are making these decisions, and that's what was really uneasy from a UK perspective. Do you think that was the beginning of the end of the UK membership, when we started to see this tendency towards a more political union without any political accountability at that level?
Well, I think in that respect we were torn. I think there's a point which is worth making, which is that the whole history of the European Union up to the point of Maastricht and indeed beyond was one of Franco-German leadership, and that's a statement of the obvious. As far as Britain's place is concerned, to me the first point where we started to veer off course, as it were, in terms of our eventual leaving of the European Union, was the creation of the exchange rate mechanism in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
The first person who Helmut Schmidt approached was Jim Callaghan, the then Prime Minister, before he approached Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the French President. And Jim Callaghan, for political reasons in regard to the Labour Party and the state of the British economy, couldn't play ball, and rather unwisely got his people to brief the British press rubbishing the project. Giscard basically overturned the advice of his officials, which was hostile to the exchange rate mechanism, and realised this was a great political opportunity. And that really cemented the Franco-German motor. And that motor was very much in operation leading up to the Single European Act, let alone Economic and Monetary Union. Before the final conclusion of the Single European Act, Margaret Thatcher put forward a document which was to be a legally binding document for the whole of the European Union on foreign policy. And she gave it privately to Helmut Kohl and to François Mitterrand and said would they give her their views. And answer came there none. There was, despite being chased up in Paris and Bonn, there was no answer. And then on the eve of the summit, French and Germans put forward a paper called Treaty on Political Union, which was basically the British document on foreign policy, topped and tailed, literally. Margaret Thatcher described it as the sort of behaviour that would get you expelled from a London club. Geoffrey Howe, 10 years after the event, Geoffrey Howe, the most pro-European of Conservative ministers, 10 years after the event, when he wrote his memoirs, was still angry at it. The British ambassador in the Netherlands was told by a Dutchman that the reason the French and Germans had done it was because they would never contemplate the idea of British leadership within the European community. But basically, the pattern of events meant that most of the member states waited for a Franco-German lead. The French and Germans planted the flag out there, and everybody else moved towards the flag. Britain usually resistant. And in a sense, in the Maastricht Treaty, what the European community did was to will the end without willing the means. Because the whole basis of operation had been that the political will alone would do it. But of course, that's not enough when you're developing a single currency. And it was compounded by the fact that when attempts were made, particularly in the Stability and Growth Pact, to inject some of the disciplines that weren't there, the first people to renege from the Stability and Growth Pact were actually the French and Germans, when people like the Portuguese and the Spaniards and others were struggling to implement it. So as far as, sorry, but I haven't answered your question, as far as democratic institutions are concerned, I mean, one of Margaret Thatcher's big beefs against Jacques Delors was a speech that he made very much towards the end of her premiership, when he basically said that the European Commission should be the executive of the European Union, answerable to the European Parliament, with the European Council, the heads of government, as a kind of Senate. Those were the three proposals to which she famously said no, no, no in the House of Commons. So that concept that Delors had of democracy, which is perfectly logical in terms of where the Treaty of Rome, basically, if you talk about ever closer union, what does ever closer union mean? What he was saying was perfectly consistent with that. But for Britain, our membership had always been this uneasy relationship between accepting the goal of ever closer union, but actually not wanting ever closer union in terms of increased devolution of powers to Brussels, as it was seen in Britain, not actually wanting that to happen. And that conflict, that tension, was always there. It was there when the government of the day was putting the original European Community legislation through the House of Commons. Geoffrey Howe was the Solicitor General at the time, who did a lot of that work. And I remember him telling me when I worked for him when he was Foreign Secretary, he said, of course, we told Parliament what was involved in terms of the powers of the European Union, but we deliberately said as little about it as possible, because we didn't want people to focus on the fact that the powers of the British Parliament would basically be the absolute one, of taking Britain out of the European community, but the British Parliament would have no power over legislation passed at European level. And that reality was a kind of thorn in our domestic flesh.
And all of that created a really quite strange dynamic, which both Steve and I saw firsthand. I mean, two parts of the dynamic. Number one, don't assume that the supposedly Europhile members of the British government at that time, take Douglas Hurd, my boss at the time, probably the best foreign secretary post-war, in my view, in terms of his command of his department. And he was always seen in the Tory party as very, very Europhile. In truth, he was always talking about a two-stage or a two-speed or inner and outer Europe all the time. So in sort of philosophical terms, we were always hunting for this non-existent model, right, on the one hand. The other, in terms of the actual operation of the Union at councils of ministers and so on, it led to a peculiar sort of comfortable stress. And it went a bit like this. As Stephen said, the French and Germans essentially would write the agenda, and then the British government would act like the handbrake, right? And it was a very comfortable handbrake for everybody else. I'll give you a quick cameo. When we were negotiating the Amsterdam Treaty, we had a thing called the Reflections Group, which drew up, and Stephen will remember it, drew up the plan for the treaty, really. And I was on it, along with a whole load of friends, a whole lot of other Europe ministers around Europe. And at the end of it, Carlos Westendorp, who was the chairman, the Spanish chairman of it, presented a report. And it got, and in it, in about 19 different places, it said some country, it put a conclusion, it said some countries objected, right? Well, we got to the first one of these, and I said, Carlos, it wasn't some countries, it was Britain that objected, right? And he said, well, I was trying to prevent you being embarrassed. I said, I'm not embarrassed, I want it to be known, I objected to this. At that point, I think it was, on the first one, it was Denmark, said, actually, they'd not said a word through the entire negotiation, right? That they said, actually, we'd prefer you to keep it as some countries, because they themselves were and all the way through, of those 19 some countries, which we only we had argued about, eventually only 4 became Britain only, because the other countries were very happy for our handbrake to be in place. Now that's all fine and good, but it created this permanent, maybe productive tension, but this permanent tension inside the Union. Does that sound wrong to you, Stephen? Or
no, it sounds absolutely right. And certainly after Labour got in 1997, and I was on the group that was then looking at the Amsterdam Treaty, and in many respects the Labour government wasn't very different from its Conservative predecessors, but there were some. So the first meeting after the general election, issues which I had been virulently opposed to on David Davies's personal instructions the week before, I was sitting on my hands, and anxious Finns and others were coming up to me saying, aren't you going to intervene on this? I said, sorry boys, you're on your own.
And so, Anand, do you think, I guess then, that it was that democratic deficit then that was the cause of the beginning at the end for the UK? Because we've had variants of that, but from when you look at the examples of policies and so on, do you think that was the catalyst for it to what we then saw in Brexit a few years ago?
No, I don't think it was the democratic deficit. I mean, there were running sores in our relationship with Europe. I mean, the budget was almost a sore before we joined, in the sense that the French stitched it up very deliberately in the budget treaties before our accession, and so that.
Could you go a bit more into that, please?
You don't want me to go into the budget treaties of 17. Seriously, you really don't. All I'll say is there was a deal stitched up in the early 1970s with a view to British membership that basically locked in budgetary arrangements and led to the fact that we spent our first 10 years of membership moaning about budgetary arrangements that they'd locked in. So that all these things have a long history. I mean, Gateskill was talking about 1,000 years of British history with regard to sovereignty and control long before we joined. So these things date back even prior to our membership. So I don't think it was the specifics of democracy in the European Union. It was well, you know, I mean, the referendum campaign sort of summarised them very well, didn't they? There was control over money, control over laws, and which became a very, very big issue at the tail end of the Eurozone crisis, even more so than it had been from 2004 onwards, the question of immigration, which was the latecomer. I mean, one of the interesting things about the Bloomberg speech is David Cameron did not mention migration. It just simply was not an issue in the relationship between the UK and the EU when he made that speech in 2013. So I think there were very long-standing issues that were sort of partly just a function of how we see the world differently, and they were exploited, you know, brilliantly by the Leave campaign in 2016. So it's not democracy per se; it's sovereignty, I think, is the key, which is different, isn't it? Which is, you know, even if the system sort of feels a bit democratic, it is the question of being outvoted. It's the question of having to deal with laws that you might have disagreed with, and the supremacy of those laws that I think was at the heart of it.
Yeah.
Just on the budget point, I mean, the key thing was that when Britain joined, out of the 9 member states, every member state except Germany and Britain got more money back from the European budget than they put in. And the Germans were by far and away the wealthiest country, and the only countries in the European community that were poorer than Britain at the time were Ireland and Italy. So it was something that had to be corrected. And it took 10 years to do it, and it involved Margaret Thatcher in ferocious rows with her partners. And as far as she was concerned, after that, she didn't trust them. She thought they were a bunch of shysters, basically. And she never really kind of recovered from that. On the democracy point, I mean, one of the things that was very striking about the approach of successive British governments was to pay no regard to the European Parliament or the potential significance of the European Parliament. When I was working on European issues in the Foreign Office, if the constituent of a British member of the European Parliament wrote to them, the rules were that that letter should be passed, if it came to the Foreign Office, for very often the MEP, just as MPs did, would send a letter in saying, you know, what is the Foreign Secretary's view? And our instructions were to pass it to the member of the British Parliament, take it away from the member of the European Parliament. Now, this was a scandal, really. I mean, but it was deliberately designed to minimise the importance of the European Parliament. When I worked subsequently for Tony Blair, and I was constantly trying to tell him about the importance of the European Parliament, I never got very far with him. At the end of the British presidency in '98, he went and gave the traditional speech that the president of the council gives to the European Parliament, and he, being the clever guy he is, he gave a good speech and then answered questions, and it was a humdinger. And we came out and we got in the car, and Tony Blair to me said, "Well, that's enough of that bollocks."
Simona, I wanted to bring you in because we've been talking quite a bit. Let's go back to the EU perspective, because it's been very UK.
I wanted to say something about the UK, just a little bit, because I was very intrigued by what Armand said, that actually migration was not an issue when David Cameron proposed Brexit, or was talking about Brexit, not proposed because he was against it. But that's very interesting, because it must have not been a reason for Brexit. And just to give you an idea, at the moment net migration to the UK is 500,000, and it was 100,000 when Brexit happened in 2016. And it is all third country nationals. Actually, net migration from the EU is negative at the moment, 5,000 less. It means that there are less EU people coming here that they go back home. And so it's interesting to see that migration could have not been an issue at all, because otherwise we wouldn't have it 5 times higher than it used to be when you were in the EU.
I'm not sure.
I'm sure.
I'm not sure that's true for a huge number of reasons. Firstly,
it is true.
In 2016, and for the previous, I think since about 2001, immigration had been amongst the top 3 issues of concern to the British public. Now it's fallen a lot further
Amazingly,
down.
Given the numbers, and the numbers are correct.
Secondly, I think the issue of control matters. I think for the British public, one of the reasons why British public opinion has shifted so sharply on immigration from 2016 to today, I'm sure, is to do with the fact that we get to choose. And that makes a huge difference. And the third thing is the nature of immigration has shifted quite fundamentally. This isn't making a value judgment about what's good or what's bad, but with freedom of movement, one of the things that happened is East Europeans used to come in and do low-paid jobs in poor parts of the country where services were already stretched, where, you know, there was already a queue for your GP surgery, where schools weren't very good. Under the new points-based system, where you have to have a salary of 25 grand plus to come in, there aren't that many jobs in Boston and Lincolnshire that pay 25 grand. So these people are going into prosperous parts of the country, mainly cities, where people are very tolerant of immigration. So the whole profile of immigration, the numbers might be higher, but the profile and the geographical destination has altered fundamentally.
No, I doubt it, seriously. We cannot enter this discussion with a seriously doubt. It is 5 times higher. And
no, because the figure in May 2016 was 300,000. The net figure was 300,000 in May 2016.
I think in terms of the salience of it, I can remember Tony Blair saying after he'd won the 2002 election, the thing that could lose me the next election is migration.
Yeah, can I just, since I suppose I've probably spoken to more people on the doorstep about this subject than anybody else, you know. And during the referendum, particularly in sort of working class districts, people come up to me and I'd say, what's your view? And they'd say, I want to leave. And I'd say, why? And let me just give you one caveat of this, because it highlights a number of things. It's West Yorkshire. The man was a painter and decorator, ran his own company, right? His own tiny little company. And I said, you want to leave? He said, yeah. I said, why? He said, migration. And I thought, here we go. You know, so I was expecting a sort of bigoted rant. So I said, really, don't you like foreigners? And he said, oh, no. He said, if I were a Pole or a Bulgarian, I'd be here, working for 3 times the money I'd get back home and sending half of it home. I'd do exactly that. He said, the trouble is, Mr. Davis, for the last 10 years, I haven't had a pay increase. And if I didn't give him a job, my son will be unemployed. And that was the perspective. So it's not an irrational viewpoint. And it comes right back to your point of who it is that the migrants are and who they are competing with, both in terms of work and in terms of services. And I think that has changed. You're right about the numbers are big. I mean, last year's numbers on migration, last time I looked, there were 350,000 circuit employment certificates given out. So it was real, and frankly, I think it did dictate the outcome of the referendum, because I think David, when he, for reasons which we talked about before, went into that so-called renegotiation of our membership, it was all about migration. He was talking there, and he was seen to have failed, and whatever the rights and wrongs of it were, that I think probably had more than a 2% effect on the referendum outcome. And a 2% effect is the difference between winning and losing it. So I think it was quite material in its political leverage. Whatever it is in objective economic terms or even objective numerical terms, it's very, very seriously important from a political point of view.
It's clear to see that migration is still such a hot topic, and I guess the origins of it being very contentious here in the UK could be led back to the Maastricht Treaty. In terms of rounding things up, because I'm sure we may have some questions in the audience here, it'd be great to just get each of our panellists' views on whether they, first of all, feel that the Maastricht Treaty has been a success. Should it be celebrated? And where do you see the state of things going forward? What's been its legacy or its biggest, I guess, problem that the EU, or from a UK perspective, still needs to be tackled? So, Simona, will come to you.
For whether it was a success, I'm not sure it was a success or not, but I can see the legacy is enormous. I mean, the economic and monetary union is there, and it's been there since the Maastricht Treaty. It took some time to have it implemented, but it was there. And I guess the Maastricht Treaty was mostly about establishing the EMU. The Intergovernmental Conference on the Political Union was a failure from the beginning, and it really didn't matter that much, honestly. So the clue was the EMU, and the EMU is still here. So I'm not sure it was a success or not. As I said, for some countries, definitely. For others, maybe less. The other point, I still believe that one of the contentious, the social chapter has been completely superseded by events, let's put it this way. And the other element is EU citizenship, and we're still discussing it. And so I think that was another contentious element, especially the distinction between intra-EU mobility and the third country national. That was something that did not happen with Maastricht, but was established in Maastricht. So I would say these were the elements that are basically there to stay.
David, sorry?
Well, I mean, I'm afraid I would repeat what I said earlier, that it depends who you are. You know, if you're Germany, it's a fantastic success.
So from the UK perspective, could we
the
say
UK perspective,
pre-Brexit and then I guess
Well, from
now?
the UK perspective, Maastricht plus the ERM crisis plus the Cameron negotiation between them delivered Brexit. So if you like Brexit, then it's a success from one point of view. And if you don't like Brexit, then look back to Maastricht as the start of the problem.
And Anne, we'll come to you, please.
I think the amazing thing about Maastricht is it's 30 years on, it's unfinished business. I mean, if you'd said to the people who negotiated the treaty in the European Council that their successors now would still be wrestling with the gaps that they left in their treaty, whether it's the gaps over migration policy, whether it's a gap over fiscal policy, they would have been amazed. I mean, it has dominated, you know, the unfinished elements of the Maastricht Treaty dominate Europe to this day. They dominate the discourse over strategic autonomy. It was a treaty of aspiration that left a lot of the details to future generations, and those future generations haven't filled in the details yet. So it's an ongoing story, and in a way, I know this is a pathetic answer, it's probably too early to say whether Maastricht has been a success or a failure for the European Union, because we don't quite know where the Maastricht story ends, and I don't think we will for a while.
It's up there with the French Revolution.
Too soon to tell.
So TBC for you, and David, how about you?
David,
sorry, Stephen.
in terms of the British government's objectives at the time, it was a success. The British government achieved what it wanted to achieve. It was the parting of the ways. I mean, this was a very, the most major initiative really that the European Union had taken since the foundation in the Treaty of Rome, and Britain was not part of it. I was the permanent representative in Brussels when the single currency came into effect, and I asked one of the younger members of my staff, a very bright young official called David Frost, to draft a paper which we sent back to London. And in that paper, we said that we thought that very quickly the countries in the Eurozone would start to harmonise their policy across a whole range of issues not directly connected with the single currency, which we would then find ourselves excluded from. Now, we were wrong, at least in the short term, in that prediction. But I agree with what Anita said. It has taken a long time for economic and monetary union to get even to the point that it is now. But you can see the course that it's on. I mean, fiscal harmonisation is there on the agenda, and it may be that the history of the European Union would be like that of the United States in that respect. These things will take time, but I think the course that the Maastricht Treaty has set is certainly irrevocable.
I mean, the one difference I'd say, which is crucial, is the US did the hard bits first.
True.
Well, if you wouldn't mind just giving our lovely panel a round of applause, please. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and share your views and experiences. I believe we have a microphone here. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. Oh, a few. Fantastic. So yeah, if we could start at the back, please. The gentleman in the white or cream jumper. Would you mind just telling us your name and background and why you're here? It'd be great to hear that. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. The name's Ewan Grant. I was a former law enforcement intelligence analyst covering the ex-Soviet states, and I've worked in EU programs in the ex-Soviet Union, particularly in Ukraine, including just before and just after the Maidan. I'm now a broadcaster and journalist, so I've been a bit busy with the war. I did see some deeply sinister behaviour by a number of officials working for EU programmes. My question is, in your experiences, what were the relationships and differences and similarities between officials from the member states and from the Commission? I mean, there's been references to foreign ministers, mainly prime ministers or presidents, and Mr. Delors, but how did they interact, and how did British officials, both diplomats and British Commission officials, interact in all this period? Thanks.
Was there anyone in mind you had, first of all, Ewan?
Anyone.
Okay.
Or ideally all of you.
Well,
Yeah.
I'm not able to
Simona?
answer. No, I'm not able to answer this question. I
Okay.
was never in negotiations with any
Well,
officials.
To my left, we know someone was definitely there. So let's start with you,
Well,
David.
Before I talk about the European Union officials, when I first arrived under Stephan Wall's wing, basically, as a new minister, I asked for any intel that we had on the mode of operation of our allies, Germans, French, and so on. And we happened to have had two of our bright civil servants who'd been seconded to each of them. And it was quite interesting because the one who'd worked with the Germans said basically it's like Britain but worse. You know, the bureaucrats work it all up, you know, and write everything, and then the ministers go along with it, which is broadly true. Whereas in France, they'd get, I mean, I think what the person used was troglodytes to write all the text, and then the senior civil servant, not even the minister, the enarch in charge, would then ignore it all, you know, and do what he wanted to do. And broadly speaking, that's what you saw. You saw the Germans turn up with a clear sort of negotiating aim, and aim to that aim, and then stop when they get there almost. And the French would come and play it almost like a very good batsman and score sixes. You know, sometimes they get run out, but they score sixes. So that was the sort of, and then the others. You can almost draw your own cameos for the others. Before the Swedes joined, we had trouble getting the councils and ministers to start on time, and the Spaniards were in some ways the worst. And I only realised after a while they used to refer to punctuality in the council ministers as hora inglés, because we were there at the beginning, right? But generally, you know, you had national character coming out and all those things. But the issue, the attitude of the Commission, I think has changed over time, because when I was first involved, it was actually quite open. They'd have their aims very clear, and they'd drive towards them, very often in conjunction with the French and the Germans. But they were fairly open to conversation. When I saw them more recently, partly after the elevation of the European Parliament and things, it's become much more of an echo chamber. I suspect it's harder to influence today than it would have been 20 years ago. I don't know that to be the case, but that's my impression.
I think that we in Britain often tended to overlook to think or want to think of the Commission simply as a bureaucracy like any other bureaucracy.
No,
but of course, under the treaties, it has very specific powers, including, of course, the sole power of initiative, which is a very important power. And the Commission took that very seriously and proactively. And in Jacques Delors, who was the greatest president of the Commission that the Commission has had in the history, I think, of the European Union, he was determined to advance the frontiers of European Union and had a very, very clear agenda to that effect. And so, to that extent, we were at loggerheads with the Commission. The best Commission officials are at least as good, if not better, than any that I come across in national governments, including our own.
Partly because we send them over there.
One thing that was very striking was that if you went to a council meeting, particularly a meeting of the European Council, the discussions took place, and then the Commission would go away and with the presidency and draft the conclusions. And at about 5 o'clock in the morning of the last day, you would, as officials, you would get the conclusions. And between then and going to have a meeting with the Prime Minister, be it Margaret Thatcher or then John Major or Tony Blair, we officials would go through the text, basically looking for points where the Commission, as we saw it, were trying to pull a fast one. In other words, we're trying to claw back some point that we thought they'd lost, or insert some point that they were trying to get through, and hope that nobody would notice. So they definitely had an agenda.
Ananda, do you want to add anything?
I mean, what I would say is that interface between sort of national civil servants and the Commission is really interesting. And one of the things that member states are sort of variable at is coordinating the people they have in the Commission. I remember sort of when I used to do academic research on this, that some member states were absolutely assiduous at regular drinks parties and sort of receptions for their nationals in the European Commission, to keep them in touch with the national administration. You know, the flip side was let us know if anything's coming up that we might be a bit upset about or concerned about. Some member states were very, very good at that. We got quite good at that, I think, towards the latter days of our membership. But playing that game of using Commission officials, I mean, Commission officials, whatever, you know, the remit of the Commission is, are nationals of a member state. And some member states were far better at playing that game, I think, than others.
Empirically, the French lost very, very few QMVs, almost none. We lost more than anybody else, and I think the Germans were second to us, actually. To give you a sort of measure of how it played out. Now, whether that's a difference of aim or a difference of skill or not using the system as you describe it, you can draw your own conclusion, really.
Yep. Could you please come over here? The gentleman at the front first. Yeah, a microphone's coming for you. Thank you. And it'd be great again if you could just give us your name and what it is that's brought you along to tonight's event.
My name's Dennis Loretto. I'm retired company director, Liberal Democrat, member of the European Union, one of the founders of the Alliance Party of Northern Ireland.
All right.
If I'd come into this room completely without knowledge, which I almost did, but I have a wee bit of knowledge, I would have thought that what we were hearing was something that had crashed and burned, and we were poking through the ashes and wondering, was it really a good idea? Pity that it failed, etc. Except at the very end, when for a few sentences I heard the words Maastricht and success actually in the same sentence. That was the only time during this meeting that I heard anything like that. Most of it was talking about the entire British perspective. And given that what we actually are seeing now is a pretty successful European Union, you can argue the degree of that. Think of all the countries that are out from under the heel of the Soviet Union, for one. And on the other hand, these, frankly, I think at the moment rather sad little islands off the northern shore separated itself from this. And I wonder why we're talking about Maastricht as if it was a failure. I think that perfection sometimes is the enemy of some kind of reasonable success. Because it wasn't quite what we would have wanted, we didn't quite have this, and we didn't get that, and Britain didn't get it. Therefore, we crashed the whole thing and burned ourselves. Is that, it's not a question, it's a comment, but is it a reasonable point that I'm making?
I think Simona did stress at the start that it was a success. We do have a Conservative Member of Parliament in here, so he's going to put forward his lived experience of it, and equally someone else who was there. So I can understand where you're coming from, but I do think we did explore some of that. And Simona, do you want to add to why else you felt it was a success?
Well, it's been very clear that we have to see it from different perspectives, and obviously, as I said, I mean, from my country's Italian perspective, without Maastricht and without the EU, we would be much worse off. And I'm not saying that the same would be the case for the UK, which would require a long discussion, I would say. But certainly for EU members, Maastricht is the beginning of road towards a much more successful union. Obviously, there are limits, as we discussed, but I do believe without Maastricht, there are limits, we discussed that, but without Maastricht, Europe would not look the same in any possible way. So that, as I say, it is the beginning of the EU citizenship concept, the economic and monetary union, which made Europe competitive globally. Otherwise, we wouldn't be there. Honestly, I mean, as single currencies, as well as single countries. So I do believe that it was a success for us. Then I leave to the people who were there to discuss why the UK didn't want Maastricht from the beginning. That's clear. No, now. Yeah. And I can give you some hints, but I don't want to.
Sorry, Anand wanted to add to that, I believe.
I think that's a bit unfair in the sense that you can think of European integration. I mean, I agree that enlargement has been spectacularly successful. I think the single market has been spectacularly successful. The question we were asking was whether, and I think you would struggle to argue that CFSP or EU immigration and asylum policies have been massively successful. I mean, there are bits of the Maastricht Treaty that, and we can have an argument about.
Yeah.
So this isn't
a question about whether European Union has brought benefits or not. It's a specific question about this treaty, unless we forget the French came awfully close to voting down the Maastricht Treaty as well.
The Petit Oui, it was called, remember? Which is, can I just come in? Look, I'm the risk of sounding like a sort of one-track record. One of the reasons I said it depends on where you come from, where which country, is deeply historical as well as modern. So, go through them. Spain, dictatorship before it joined the Union. Portugal, Caetano, dictatorship before. Greece, the colonels. And Greece is still in despite the crash, right? Obviously, Germany, Italy, their history and so on. The ex-Soviet states and so on. They have a very different set of hierarchy of values, if you like, to us. We come in as several hundred years. I was going to say 1,000 years, nonsense. 100-year majority, 100-year democracy, and so have different expectations, which is why the outcomes are different for each of us. Yeah.
Thank you for raising that point.
Can I just make a point as well? I mean, I see exactly where you're coming from. But, I mean, from the British perspective, there was no way any British Prime Minister could deliver the single currency politically within Britain. I mean, that's a sad fact of life. Exactly. We got the opt-out because the politics of Britain did not allow for John Major to do anything else. The politics didn't, in the end, allow Tony Blair to take Britain into the single currency, although that was certainly his intention.
Thank you very much for that question. Definitely sparked some more debate. I believe, yes, the gentleman with the glasses, please. Thank you, here in the suit.
Thank you. My name is Michael Laurence. I'm here very much in a personal capacity. 30 years ago, as a 18-year-old French citizen, I cast my first vote on European integration. That was the first of 3 referendums. In 2005, the Constitution, and then as a British citizen, 2016, the Brexit referendum. So it's all bringing back memories. It's great. Thank you to Kings and the panel. For this discussion tonight. My question is about a part of the Maastricht Treaty which has been barely touched by the panel, and you will recall the pillared structure, and obviously we've spent a lot of time talking about economic and monetary union. The third pillar is about justice and affairs cooperation. It evolves into the area of freedom, security and justice. It was discussed as part of the Brexit debate. It probably didn't play a central role, but there were concerns expressed about loss of police cooperation, or lesser forms of police cooperation, lesser forms of security cooperation, as well as probably more niche issues, but closer to my professional life, recognition of judgments, across the EU and so on. Mm-hmm. So my question is really about whether the panel has any views on the success of otherwise of justice and affairs cooperation, and where that leaves Britain post-Brexit. Thank you.
Well, we didn't talk so much because still the third pillar of the Maastricht Treaty was an intergovernmentalist one. Very little supranational, actually no supranational element in it. So if you want to say it was still like cooperation between the state with little supranationalization. And that is, in the economic and monetary union, on the other hand, we have a complete communitarization of a policy, which is monetary policy. And so this is why, what success? Success is difficult to say because Home and Justice Affairs is the pillar that then evolved into the EU migratory policy with the Amsterdam Treaty's Title 4. Sorry, with the Amsterdam Treaty was Title 4, and with the Lisbon Treaty's Title 5 of the acquis communautaire, which do not yet include everything relating to Home and Justice Affairs cooperation. So I think even criminal issues are still out of it. There are some, I'm not a lawyer, but there are many issues which are still out of it. And I would say that basically that is the least successful part of the Maastricht Treaty, because on Home and Justice Affairs, especially in relation to migration, especially in relation to the rights of migrants, we're really far away from achieving any form of real cooperation. But even in terms of allocation of refugees, or that comes much later. Obviously, it's not Maastricht. It all comes later. We're still discussing it seriously. I mean, it's not. I wouldn't say it's a success, the EU approach to third country national migration. Honestly, there is a lot going on. There is like externalization. There is a lot of securitization, even militarization after the crisis of refugees in 2015. We had a little, like glimpse of what life could be like with the refugees from Ukraine, but that is only for this case, and I don't think there is any hope it would be extended, or at least I don't see it being extended to. And it's still temporary protection, only afforded for 1 to 3 years. So I would say that is really the least developed part of the whole building of Europe. Whether you like it or not, it depends. But
I broadly agree with that. I mean, if you think of the sort of 3 big pillars of British government, obviously the economy, the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and the Home Office in particular, is the most political, the most politically sensitive, whether it's migration or crime or any other element of law and order. And I think, Stephen will correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the major complaints of the Danes when they lost their referendum was on the Home Affairs pillar. I happen to think that neither of those two, neither Home Affairs nor CFSP, worked at all well. Yeah. I mean, CFSP, just to jump off your subject for a second, the European Union stood back for 4 years of atrocities in the ex-Yugoslavia. And in Home Affairs, it's made slow progress. It will make better progress with us outside because we've got a completely different legal system. And it would never have made much progress with the British legal system. We're much better with the Napoleonic one, but that's a century-long project. I think it's not something's going to happen tomorrow.
I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, firstly, the sort of appalling self-congratulatory names that the EU gives its policy areas. I mean, the area of freedom, security, and justice is enough to turn your stomach. Secondly, it's been a limited success. I mean, if you talk to sort of law enforcement officers across Europe, some of the data sharing and Europol stuff has helped them in their fight against transnational and organised crime. I don't think there's any doubt about that whatsoever. But looking as a whole, have EU attempts to deal with inward migration from outside Europe been successful? Absolutely not. No. In fact, they've led to some colossal failures and some moral failures. I mean, remember it was the European Union that was paying Gaddafi to set up camps.
Yeah.
So, it's a mixed picture at best. Actually, my pet theory about the third pillar is it had quite a lot of impact on Brexit, because I always suspected that when Theresa May became Prime Minister, her experience of dealing with the European Union was opting into bits of the third pillar, because that was the deal she had. And I always watched her in the Brexit negotiations and thought, she thinks she can do that across the board. Yeah. You can opt into the bits you like, as you could do in the third pillar. And I always thought that was how she approached the Brexit negotiations, which was one of the reasons why they didn't actually turn out so well for her.
That's about right, I think.
Anything to add? No? Okay. I believe we had another question. Did you have your hand raised? Yes, please. Thank you very much. Again, if you could just give your name and what's brought you along to today's event.
Thank you. Quentin Peel, attached to Chatham House, and I suppose the answer to your second question is nostalgia.
We all love a bit of nostalgia. You're forgiven.
Not many people are nostalgic for Maastricht, I tell you.
No, what I'm interested, though, is that I haven't heard any of you really raise the one sort of geopolitical ruction that had happened before Maastricht, and that surely had a great effect on both sides of the Maastricht debate, German unification. Mm-hmm. That German unification was a huge driving factor in tipping France into wanting more Europe, but was also a very significant factor, surely, in making that grumbling minority in the Conservative Party into a howling majority.
I mean, cynically, it almost drove France into feeling it needed more European integration than it wanted. I mean, it pushed everyone further than they wanted. And actually, you're absolutely right. It's the missing element. And actually thinking about the comparison between then and now, one is forced to wonder about the implications. I mean, you know, you've got COVID and you've got the war in Ukraine as sort of external pressures on European integration. And it'll be interesting to see whether they have anything near the same results. I mean, the Germans played it quite well, didn't they, in Maastricht, given that. They were pressured by the French, and the deal was political union in exchange for the Deutschmark. And the Germans got monetary union, but never really, as we see to this day, have quite conceded the bit that the French wanted, and are still proving remarkably reluctant.
I think that at the time, it was very striking how nervous the French were about German reunification. I mean, the French, apart from Mitterrand's own attitude and his famous conversation with Margaret Thatcher, which was one of the reasons why mistakenly she dug in when they met in the margins of a Strasbourg European Council, and he said, you know, this is a country that has never known where its frontiers lie, speaking of Germany. But Mitterrand wisely recognized the inevitability of reunification. But I think, you know, the French media at the time were torn between either this is going to mean a reunited Germany absolutely dominates and we are kind of cut out of the mix, or it will kind of drift off into a sort of dangerous neutrality given its interest to the east, and hence, of course, the deal that Mitterrand and Kohl did. Absolutely.
Can I just add one thing? I mean, I remember I was in France at the time of the referendum, and the Parti Socialiste had a poster, sort of asking people to vote in favour of Maastricht, and it basically had a Hitler figure on it. And, you know, the message was, vote for the Maastricht Treaty or this will be the Germany you're unleashing. And it really was quite remarkable.
The other thing, which I think we in the British civil service and ministers as well didn't really appreciate was, and there's a speech which Helmut Kohl made in Britain, and I think in about 1984 in Oxford, where it becomes clearer that we underestimated, because we didn't think German reunification was going to happen in our lifetime, we underestimated the extent to which, for Kohl, that was in his mind, and he always saw European Union as the acceptable framework in which German reunification could happen, acceptable to others, and indeed necessary for German reunification to happen in a way that was preserve the peaceful settlement of post-war Europe. And we didn't really see that.
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, I think Thatcher was wrong. The unification was inevitable from the fall of the wall, as it were, from the end of the Iron Curtain, and that's, of course, that's a bigger shock effect in truth. I mean, because all of the other Eastern European countries that came in. So, in that respect, I suppose you could say Maastricht at least didn't do harm.
Were there any more questions? Yes. Okay, our final one. If you could please go along to the middle. Thank you so much.
Hello. Patrick Newman, failed parliamentary candidate for Labour some time ago. In fact, I think I might have helped Mrs Thatcher gain power. Just a bit of light relief in a way is that the famous Nobody Mentioned the War sketch is being...
I stayed off Basil Fawlty, so...
I just wonder what the panel might think about whether that is a sketch that might, in its own form, in a different form, run within the Labour Party at the next general election.
Which sketch?
Would you mind just delving into which sketch exactly?
There is a sketch in 40 Towers where there are German visitors coming to visit. This is was it 40 years ago? And the proprietor says, make sure nobody mentions the war. And then the rest of the sketch is people accidentally or deliberately mentioning the war. Now, I thought there might be a parallel situation with the Labour Party in the next general election, where somebody's saying, nobody mention Brexit.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Who would like to jump on that question?
Well, it's not for me to give advice to the Labour Party.
Okay, well, David's going to stay quiet on that one. Let's turn to Anand then, please.
I mean, yeah, because why would Labour want to talk about Brexit? I mean, the only thing that unites the Conservative coalition from December 2019 was Brexit. Okay, and sort of, you know, you can see with the divisions over economy. Why would Labour want to mention it? Labour want to have an election campaign where no one mentions Brexit. They want to talk about the economy, and they want to accuse the government of economic failure. So, and you know, it always amazes me the number of people out there saying, why doesn't Keir Starmer change his stance on Brexit? Keir Starmer in the latest poll was 26 points ahead. Why would you structurally change the nature of your message when you're 26 points ahead? I mean, it might be that Labour says something different if it gets into power.
It might be.
But I think Labour have every reason to worry that
Brexit
exactly those voters who might switch from Tory to Labour might be sensitive to a softer message on Brexit. So I think he'll keep his head down and not talk about it.
Simona, it sounded like you wanted to add to that.
No, I agree completely with Anna. There is really no reason why you should open the Pandora box again. It's already been closed, it's there. I mean, Brexit exists, it's here to stay, honestly, I believe it is. There might be arrangements with Europe which are different from the one you have at the moment, but definitely not re-entering the EU. So they wouldn't make any sense. It wouldn't make any sense, I believe.
Stephen?
Even so, as I speak as a citizen, it is sad to me that to see the Labour Party, which on present form will probably be the next government, not putting forward any vision for our place in Europe. And David Lammy making a speech last week in which he talked about our red lines, which is straight back to where we were 30 years ago.
Okay, well, Patrick, thank you for that last note. It seems like they agree with you and that sketch may come to be. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening at Bush House in King's College. It's been great to have your company. Thank you to our panel again. We've had Stephen, Anand, David and Simona. If you could just give them another round of applause, please. Thank you. And as promised by Ramon at the start, there are refreshments here, so please do take advantage of them before you make your way out to the cold London city again, and get home safely. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Anita.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you.
Hey, very nice.
That's fun.